Hey guys, thought I'd do another little video here, just just to add to the list of stuff that I do while I chat and work. Got a sketch of Thomas here from Original Life Plus 5. It was a very quick warm up that I did, because sometimes that's just what we want to do. Just warm up with something nice and work on it real quick before we get into the heavy work of our day. And I thought that I would talk about, given the recent Original Life comic that I did. I'm on the artificial intelligence, the robot boyfriend arc right now. I thought I'd talk about free will, which is kind of a hot little topic amongst a lot of philosophers and atheists these days, and sort of my take on it based on everything I've absorbed and everything I understand about consciousness and everything I've thought about the mind and whatnot, and where I think that most of the debate goes astray. I think a lot of people treat it with kind of there's a lot of false dichotomies and false alternatives in these kinds of discussions, and people asserting a degree of fatalism, and I think for a number of motivations. I think some people are just people who deny free will. Come at it from, I've noticed, several motivations. Some of them are just pure materialists, and those, I can respect them, and that's fine. Whereas I think that, let's see here. Thomas sketch. I think that most people, or a lot of people, if you think things through really well and you have a position, it's awesome to hear you talk about it. I do a lot of listening to just really thoughtful, philosophically minded people, people who I agree with, people who I don't agree with, people who I kind of partially agree with, and stuff like that. To me, it's very interesting to hear them discuss, especially if they can spell out why they think something, it's not just an emotion that they have that causes them to have an opinion, and you can tell those people right away, and they're some of the least interesting people to talk about. I think the only people who listen to those kinds of people are people who are looking for someone to sort of validate their own position, their own emotional position, and really they don't really serve anything valuable when it comes to the intellectual discussion of anything. But there are other people who I think deny free will because they are looking for a way to absolve themselves of personal responsibility for the outcome of their life or existence and whatever, and these people just usually aren't really worth listening to be honest. So I think most of this is rooted in either an acceptance or a rejection of what in secular circles we might call the body-mind dichotomy, or false dichotomy, as I'd rather say. In religious circles, this manifests itself as the dichotomy between body and spirit, where spirit often represents sort of an emotional capacity rather than an intellectual capacity, but still, it's kind of the same thing as the mind-body dichotomy. And what it comes from is in the human mind being as powerful as it is and as complex as it is, our mind has the ability to conceive of itself separate from its physical being. That's just one of these weird traits that we have as a species. And this transcends all human culture and everything else, which is why thoughts of ghosts and spirits and things like that tend to permeate human culture. And we tend to think of our bodies as vehicles that we're driving rather than what we actually are. And this bears out in doctors who've worked with teenagers who are doing drugs. These teenagers, they may or may not be addicts, but they're doing drugs recreationally, really, really bad drugs like Molly and things like that. And what they try to warn these kids, hey, this is damaging your brain. You can give yourself brain damage with these drugs. You need to take it easy and knock it off. And it's very hard to get through to them. Like, they often are very dismissive of this warning because they're either unable to assess the risk, or they're expressing sort of a manifestation of this dichotomy where they don't see themselves as the physical organs that make up their body. They see themselves as something separate. So and then they have to, in order to bring that warning home, it has to be explained to them, no, you don't understand. Your brain that you're damaging, that is you. All of it. All of you. Everything that you are, everything that you think, everything that you feel, everything that, when you experience an emotion, a hormone, whatever, all of that awareness is the physical meat between your ears. It doesn't exist anywhere else. And then things like brain damage and stuff start to kind of hit home with some of the more thoughtful people, shall we say. And I think that when we go full into the materialist framework in that respect, which is, the correct framework is to understand that our personalities exist in the mind, so that when you die, there's nothing there that gets transferred. If you think that you're a spirit that floats away, or a ghost or something where your consciousness transcends, and you can get into discussions, and I've often gotten into these discussions. Okay, well, which version of yourself is it? If you die with Alzheimer's disease, does your consciousness, does your ghost revert to the nice consciousness that knew all kinds of stuff and remembered all your loved ones and was had full clarity of thought, or does your ghost sort of just pick up whatever your brain's potency level was, which wasn't that high, when you die? And then why? And most religious people would pick the sweet, pretty answer because that's what they want to believe, but there's no theological basis for it, I don't think. Not that I can think of offhand, anyway. And we know that we can affect memory, we can affect personality by changing and damaging portions of the physical brain. There was a guy in the 1800s who had a railroad spike driven through his head on accident, and he didn't do it on purpose, but and he survived by some miracle, but his personality was completely altered because it had damaged a part of his brain that deals with like emotional and affectation and the ability to regulate these emotions, and he was a completely different guy. He couldn't regulate his anger. He had outbursts and all kinds of things, and this shows that he didn't have a ghost, or he didn't have a consciousness that was separate from his body, driving his body. And I think a lot of materialists will point to this as evidence that, see, we are our biological processes that we don't have control over. We are sort of a confluence of these things, and therefore we don't truly have free will. We're not a pilot in a vehicle. We are just that vehicle. Christopher Hitchens, who I don't know what his view on free will was, he said during, I think, the weeks before he died, he said it was important to remember that I don't have a body, that I am a body. And that's a pretty important distinction philosophically. I know that most people say have a body just as a cultural colloquialism, but it does lead one to think that your body is just a possession. It isn't actually your identity, your individuated physical and only form. And I think it's important to understand that. So understanding that, I think it's very easy for then atheists to get involved with free will and say, well, if all we have are the biological processes, if that's all that there is, I think that we don't, if you peel away all the layers of complexity down to the fact that the brain is a physical form with neurochemical firings, and we can assess in a laboratory when someone makes a decision in a laboratory condition, which, by the way, isn't usually a consequential decision. It's just for lack of a better term, a random decision. The physical meat of the brain tends to seemingly make the decision before the person is aware that they've made the decision. Therefore, I don't think we have free will. And I can very clearly understand that kind of position. I can understand why someone would hold that. But I think that it's a misunderstanding of what is really meant by free will. I'm an atheist who is not a materialist. And what I think is really going on is having the free will to think or not. And what I mean by that is having the ability to pull away from whatever you're feeling, whatever urges you have, whatever seems to be a just sort of an inclination, and assessing it with your mind, assessing it intellectually, if you want to put it that way, going over the potential consequences. I'm not talking about seemingly inconsequential decisions, what to have for dinner, unless you're trying to lose weight or something like that. But I'm just talking about, whether you're going to have two equally healthy things for dinner, what are you going to pick, is not necessarily of any particular consequence. But a big decision like, are you going to go to college as soon as you leave high school? Or do you want to go into the working field, work a trade of some kind, and maybe get some more practical experience under your belt, and then decide if you want to pursue higher education after you've had some adult experience? You can weigh these things, and a lot of people, they don't make the decisions based on how they think things out. They feel pressured by parents or just the zeitgeist in general, societal pressures. Or they just kind of decide when they're young and they just keep following some kind of autopilot whose premises they may not fully understand, and when you're growing up as a kid, you do absorb a lot of premises and information that later manifests itself as emotions, unanalyzed emotions that just seem to come out of nowhere. And a lot of people just assume this is some deeper part of their core being, their spiritual being. Have you ever heard someone who had a completely preposterous point of view and you explain to them in the most rational terms possible, and they eventually just retreat to, well, this is just who I am? That's not an answer, because that's only one small step from, should this be who I am, right? That's where you get into the free will and the person who thinks. And I think most people have that ability to exercise that level of thought and free will. They may not come to the right conclusions, and correct conclusions are not guaranteed, but the decision to think is an option for most of us. Most people have that option, but they don't exercise it. I recognize that. Most people, I think, tend to go through life in large part on some kind of autopilot. They let other pressures and other factors just sort of sway their decisions. And if they perceive something as too hard, they will make their own life more difficult by not doing what they probably should do. We all probably know someone kind of like this who, someone who's unhappy in a career or a relationship, and they seem to be taking no steps to overcome it. Another common example may be a woman who was raised by an abusive alcoholic father or an abandoning father. Lo and behold, when she grows up to be an adult, who does she choose? What kind of men does she choose to date? Unavailable, abusive, broken alcoholics. Okay, there's something going on here, something much deeper that is, and this woman can either choose to get a grip on her life and understand why she does this. And this isn't easy. I'm not saying you just make this decision and become a new person. This is something that requires a commitment on the part of the thinker and requires a lot of work on their part. And that is where free will lies. It's the decision to think things through or just sort of go on some kind of autopilot. And unfortunately, most people go on autopilot. Now, I'm not referring to people, who have some profound mental handicap, who therefore they're not fully there as a normal person would be. So I'm just talking about the majority rank and file, that I believe is the nature of free will, and that almost seems self-evident to me. People may argue, well, it's an illusion, and even guys like Sam Harris will say, well, it's an illusion, it's a part of us that isn't quite true. I would say that even Sam Harris says that we don't fully understand the nature of consciousness. It appears to be more than the sum of its parts, to use a phrase. And that to me seems like not a repudiation of free will, but at least an argument against forming a conclusion about it. The fact that it doesn't seem more than the sum of its parts doesn't mean we can use a gap in knowledge to just form a conclusion. Or focus on only what we know, knowing that there's things we still don't know, and then form a conclusion, like an ultra dyed-in-the-wool materialist would do. So that's kind of where I stand on free will, and where I think a lot of people tend to miss the point. I'll point out another example. There are people. I've been watching a lot of philosophy videos, and I like listening to just thoughtful people just talk about like how they come to conclusions, and I've been listening to a lot of these guys on video who call themselves MGTOW, and it's an acronym that stands for Men Going Their Own Way, and I'd never heard of it until about a few weeks ago. And some of them are very thoughtful people. Some of them, like, they have good reasons, and they spell things out. And other people, other ones, they may be thoughtful, but that doesn't really come across in their videos. They seem just really, really kind of just spiteful and bitter. I think that there are some flaws in some of their assessments, but there's also some valuable things that people can learn from them. I'm not a MGTOW myself. I don't, I have a girlfriend, and I'm happy, but at the same time, I'm not a slave to relationships. I don't rely on relationships for my validation. But for instance, these MGTOW gentlemen, they have presumably the same urges and drives, and not just a sex drive, but seemingly the at least they grew up with the sense that, hey, having a relationship is sort of the if not an inevitability, then at least a goal in sort of the human existence, the human experience, and that therefore there is something absorbed through childhood or anything else that would draw them to these conclusions. And they have to feel these things like everyone else would. They've just made the conscious decision to forego dating altogether. And this is based on an assessment. It may be a rational assessment, and I say rational in the sense that they've decided to think. They've decided to look over the nature of reality, the nature of the biological reality of the sexes versus the legal reality, which they would argue would stem from the biological reality of the sexes and the sexual economy and all these things. And they use all these things in order to come to a conclusion about whether or not they should even participate in the dating world. They see it as a stacked deck. I'm not going to go into full detail now. I'm just going to use it as a way to illustrate that these gentlemen have exercised free will. They have looked at the situation despite their urges, despite their instincts, maybe even despite some of their initial emotional conclusions they may have come to when they thought about this. And they've come to a point where they're using their rational mind in order to intellectualize the situation and then make a conscious choice on how they want to live their lives. And over time, their emotions tend to fall in line, it seems, with their decisions, their intellectual decision. Their brain leads their heart, to use a phrase, not the other way around, right? And they will often jump to conclusions that love doesn't exist. It's just the emotional glandular squirtings, and I think that this is dependent on your definition of love. I've never defined love as that intense emotional sensation you feel when you first have an affinity for someone and they're new and exciting. And I think that's what most people think love is, and that's why they treat relationships the way they do. And that is someone just kind of acting like an animal, just sort of making these decisions and seemingly having no control over what they do. Like they can talk in a rational way over their, over beers with a few of their buddies, but they can't seem to put it to practice when it comes to the moment, because they're so compulsive when it comes to sex and relationships. These men have overcome that, and it's because they have a will. And it's important to understand that, and that we're not, for all the fact that our consciousness is locked into our physical meat brain, so to speak, and everything that we are is there, and when that's destroyed, so are we. It's important to also understand that doesn't mean that we don't have free will over what we think about, and therefore the decisions that we make and where we want our lives to consciously go. Again, most people just don't. And that's why it's very easy to come to a lot of these conclusions that, free will is an illusion. Most people just live their lives like, I hate to say thoughtless animals, but a lot of them do, I would even argue that maybe even most people do. They just kind of go along with what feels good and such, and they don't really think too deeply about why they think something, and people, you may have seen it in any discussion you have with someone where it just seems like they have an immediate emotional reaction to something, and they don't analyze why they have the emotional reaction. They don't analyze if it's correct or not, or if they should have that emotional reaction and should they make a decision on it. They just begin to rationalize and come up with all kinds of ways, and I use rationalize as in the wrong way here. They just begin to come up with all kinds of arguments as to why their emotional conclusion, their emotional feeling when they heard an idea or saw an action, why that emotional conclusion is right, and that's they can't see anything past that. Like they can't think their way out of that. Or I think more importantly is they've refused to. And it is true that there are some people who, growing up, they've never been taught to think. And so their brain, like any muscle in the body, and I know the brain's not a muscle, but bear with me, we do know that neurons form based on how you use them. We do know that the brain has never been exercised, and so they lack a sense of critical thinking faculty, and this may be something that has to be slowly relearned if you're an adult and you find yourself sort of bewildered and unable to quite understand why the world is the way it is and what's going on. So that's what I think about free will. This video, I probably going a little longer than I wanted it to, but I thought I would just address that given the topic of my current ongoing Original Life comic. And if you're interested in supporting Original Life Plus 5, I know a lot of people have really been interested in getting back into the story. And even though I made a million billion announcements about it when I announced it, or when I relaunched it months ago, people still, when I put a page up on a public gallery, they still go, "Oh my God, what is this?" So if you're interested in supporting the comic or just want to read it, you can find the link to the Patreon page below. These pages are free. You do not have to support me with money in order to read Original Life Plus 5. I want it to be a free webcomic. But any support you can offer would be greatly appreciated. So you can find the link below in the description to this video. Thank you all for listening, and I appreciate it. Bye-bye.